Hi, this is Sir Jet and welcome to another episode of the Rizal Lectures. Today I am here in Calamba City and behind me is the largest indoor stadium in the province of Laguna. This is named after our national hero. I believe this will be the home court of a professional basketball team playing in a home-and-away league. On the facade of this building is the iconic signature of our national hero. You can see that signature in all of Rizal's writings. In today's episode, we will study more about Rizal the writer. Rizal is best known as a writer. His two novels, The Noli Me Tangere and The El Filibusterismo, are synonymous to his name. But do you know that aside from these two books, Rizal also wrote a lot more of other materials? That's what we will study today. We will have a survey of all these things. In a nutshell, here is the list of the types of writings Rizal did. He wrote novels, essays in La Solidaridad, poems, comics, yes, a history book, children's stories, theatrical plays, and personal letters to his family and friends. Rizal also wrote on various topics like politics, history, folklore, nature, love, fiction, and humanism. And Rizal also wrote in various languages. He wrote mainly in Spanish because his target audience were the Spaniards in Spain, because he wanted to address his advocacies to them. We also know that Rizal wrote in Tagalog once. He tried to write his third novel in his native tongue because he wanted to write a novel for the Filipino readers. And Rizal also wrote in English, specifically the letters he wrote addressed to his sisters and nephews. He wanted to train his nephews in the English language, so he tried to communicate to them in English. In this episode, we will enumerate the different writings of Rizal so that you will see the wide repertoire of our national hero. This will be just a brief survey of the writings, but the nitty-gritty of these works would be tackled in another episode. So let's begin now with Rizal's novels. We all know that he wrote two books, The Noli Me Tangere and The El Filibusterismo. The magnitude of the impact of these two novels were so great because they changed the course of our history. These were written in the time when our country was so ripe for a revolution, and these two novels served as the spark for it to happen. Now, aside from The Noli and The Fili, do you know that Rizal also has a third novel? But it was an unfinished and untitled work. We only have around 20 plus pages of this unfinished novel. It has no title, but chapter 1 has a title. So experts just use the title of chapter 1 to refer to the whole novel. The title of chapter 1 is Makamisa, or After the Mass. This was originally written in Tagalog, but Rizal admitted that he had difficulty in writing in his native tongue, so he shifted to Spanish. So the later pages of the unfinished work were written in Spanish. Now, more details about this mysterious third novel would be discussed in another lesson. Rizal also wrote a history book, or more technically speaking, he annotated a history book. There was a 1609 history book written by a Spaniard, Antonio de Morga. The title of that book was Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, or Events in the Philippine Islands. More than 200 years later, Rizal annotated this 1609 book, and the Rizal version is titled Anotaciones de Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, or Anotaciones for short. In English, it means annotations on the events in the Philippine Islands. Annotation means inserting short explanations about the passages or the sentences written in that original history book. So what Rizal did was he explained sentence by sentence what the Spaniard de Morga wrote. Rizal did this annotation while he was in London, England, and then he published it in another country, in Paris, France. Rizal's history book is monumental because this is probably the first history book written by a Filipino. Rizal also wrote many articles in a newspaper, the La Solidaridad. This newspaper was published in Spain and Rizal wrote often for this publication. The common theme of Rizal's articles in La Solidaridad were responses to attacks by Spanish writers writing for other newspapers. And Rizal would also defend his friends and the Filipino race in his essays written in La Solidaridad. In their time, Facebook was not yet invented. So, the newspaper is the venue for ranting and counter-ranting. Some Spanish journalists would bash the Filipino journalists. And in return, Rizal would do his counter-attack on those Spaniards by writing in La Solidaridad. Sounds familiar? That's what happens in Facebook these days, right? So, they're doing it more than 100 years ago, but in a different platform. Rizal's famous articles in La Solidaridad are as follows: Una profanación, verdades nuevas, crueldad, diferencias, inconsecuencias, llanto y risas, ingratitudes. These articles were written in Spanish because this is Rizal's answers to the Spaniards' attacks on him and his countrymates. Here are more examples of Rizal's articles in La Solidaridad. The Philippines a century hence, Indolence of the Filipinos, A la Defensa, La Verdad para Todos, Vicente Barantes' Teatro Tagalog. Rizal is also a poet. He wrote several poems. The common theme of Rizal's poems is nostalgia or homesickness because he wrote these poems when he was either in Europe studying far away from home or in exile in Dapitan. Some of the poems were written for special occasions and some of the poems were just simply bursts of emotion while he was in solitude. Here are Rizal's top 10 most popular poems. Number 1 is Sa Aking Mga Kabata. But as explained in another episode, this is quite controversial because many say it's not really written by Rizal but just attributed to Rizal. Anyway, we have here in this poem the very famous line, Ang hindi magmahal sa sariling wika ay mas mabaho pa sa malansang isda. That's the most famous line kids remember about Rizal, and it comes from the poem Sa Aking Mga Kabata. Other popular poems of Rizal: Un recuerdo a mi pueblo or My Memories of My Town, A la Juventud Filipina, to the Filipino youth, Mi piden versos, I wrote verses, A las Flores de Heidelberg or The Flowers of Heidelberg, Himno al Trabajo, Song to Work, Himno a Talisay, Song for Talisay. Talisay is the district in Dapitan where Rizal was exiled. Mi Retiro or My Retreat, El Canto del Viajero, the Song of the Traveler, and Mi Ultimo Adios or My Last Farewell. That's the very last poem he wrote before he was shot in Luneta. Do you know that Rizal also wrote comic books? When he was in Dapitan, Rizal wrote a short humorous comics about Kulam or the Albularios. There were many Albularios or Kulam as they call them in Bisaya in Dapitan, and Rizal would want to sway the attention of the townsfolk from the Albulario to him, a medical doctor. He wanted to disprove or discredit the method of healing of this albulario because he's a doctor, he's a scientist, he knows that what the albularios do are not scientific. So he used comics as a tool to make the people believe in Rizal the doctor. Rizal's comics was written in Tagalog and it's part of a monologue entitled The Cure of the Bewitched, Notes on the Study of Philippine Medicine. There's a long paper and within that paper there were some frames or comic strips explaining Rizal's points. Rizal wrote this primarily for Benito Francia, the Inspector of Health, or similar to a DOH officer in Dapitan. Here are samples of the frames in that paper. So here, as you can see, there's a sick woman, and she must be telling her assistant or her companion to look for a hilot or albularyo. And here comes the albularyo. By the way, Rizal's comics is humorous. As you can see, the albularyo is bald. He wants to make the story funny for the readers. And here's another frame. Probably says that next time you don't trust the albularyo, okay? Rizal wrote another comics when he was in Europe, and this is the story of the monkey and the tortoise. It had 34 frames, and he drew this while he was in Paris in 1889. This is a very famous Tagalog fable, and Rizal put it into print or into drawings. Do you know the story of the monkey and the tortoise? At the end of the story, the tortoise outwitted the monkey. Rizal must be trying to say that sometimes the underrated would turn out to be the victors. The Monkey and the Tortoise was published in London, England. Now, aside from The Monkey and the Tortoise, Rizal also illustrated 5 fables of Hans Christian Andersen when he was in Berlin, Germany. Hans Christian Andersen is a very famous writer of children's stories, and Rizal added illustrations to make the stories more appealing to his nephews and nieces. These 5 fables are as follows: The Ugly Duckling, Tambelina, The Little Match Girl, The Angel, and Little Fir Tree. Rizal also translated these Hans Christian Andersen fables to Tagalog so that his nephews would really appreciate these world-famous children's stories. So in essence, Rizal can be considered as the father of Filipino children's literature. Amazing! Rizal also wrote letters to family members and friends very often. Most of his letters were addressed to his best friend, Ferdinand Blumentritt. The topics of his letters were also varied. He wrote about his travels, his adventures, his opinion on foreign society or the countries he visited. He talked about his everyday life. He gave bilins or reminders to his sisters what to bring along when they would visit him in Dapitan, like a pack of cigarettes, stockings, and the likes. Rizal would also write tutorials to his nephews and nieces. He would also write about his feelings about life in Dapitan and many, many more. And through these letters, we learn more about Rizal, what goes on in his mind, the everyday life he faces, his plans, and his deepest emotions. When we would read Rizal's letters, they would sound like today's travel blogs. Why did I say that? Here are some examples. When he was in Hong Kong, he said that Hong Kong is a small city, but it is very clean. When he was in Macau, he said, this city is very gloomy, almost dead. When Rizal was in the United States of America, he compared Laguna's waterfalls to the Niagara Falls, and he said that the one in his country is better than the one in the United States. When he was in Japan, he said, this place has almost zero crime rate. When he was in London, he said, this city is very boring, especially on weekends. This is what travel bloggers would write. So even before we have Facebook and the other blogging sites that you see today, Rizal was the original blogger. When Rizal was in Dapitan, he wrote often to his sisters, especially when he had some bilin or reminder what to bring to him when they visit him in his exile place. Some items that he asked his sisters to bring were cigarettes. Yes, Rizal was a smoker. In one occasion, he asked one of his sisters to send him dentistry tools. And another time, he asked his sisters to bring him lots and lots of stockings because he would put up a stockings store in the marketplace in Dapitan. When writing to his nephews, Rizal would use the English language because he wanted to correct their grammar and spelling and tutor them to be better English writers. Lastly, Rizal is also into playwriting. Yes, he's like a Shakespeare. Do you know that Rizal wrote 3 high-quality plays? El Consejo de los Dioses, or the Council of the Gods, Junto al Pasig, there at the Pasig, and Saint Eustachius, Martyr. Let's talk about Saint Eustachius Martyr first. The very first theatrical play that Rizal wrote was Saint Eustachius Martyr. He wrote this when he was a 14-year-old student in Ateneo. It was a class project. Saint Eustachius was a martyr who lived in 200 CE, and he was martyred because of his faith. Rizal made a play portraying the life of Saint Eustachius. When Rizal was studying college in UST, he wrote The Council of the Gods, and it won first prize in a UST stage play writing competition. This play is about some Roman gods in the heavens discussing among themselves whom they will bless. The third play that Rizal wrote was Junto al Pasig. It's a musical. I actually saw this. It was performed by some students in UPLB, and I was there in the theater watching them perform. It's really a very good play. Rizal wrote this when he was a 19-year-old student in UST. A Spanish professor helped him by writing the music for the play. This play is about the Virgin Mary and Satan. There were some parts that are really scary. In Rizal's time, this was performed by a theater group in UST. Rizal wrote this to honor the Lady of Peace and Good Voyage in Antipolo. As a conclusion, we can see that Rizal was a prolific and dynamic writer. He wrote about several topics, using several types of literary works, and in several languages. His repertoire as a writer is really very impressive. Some of his works were written for specific people and occasions. Some were automatic bursts of opinion and feelings, while most were very careful and deliberate expositions of his political advocacies. And looking back, the impact of his writings is really humongous. They actually changed our society inside out, especially his two novels, The Noli and the Fili. And his works are eternal. They are being read over and over for several generations now, and they will continue to be read in the future as long as we have RA 1425. As a final word, we can now boldly say that Rizal is the greatest writer of all time. Why did I say that? Because compared to the other great writers of the world, Rizal is the only one who wrote many types of literature. Others were just strictly novelists or poets. And compared with the other great writers of the world, Rizal is the only one who wrote in many languages. Others just wrote in one language. And the other great writers of the world were just confined in writing about one theme, like politics or love. But for Rizal, he practically wrote about everything under the sun. So would you agree with me that Rizal is the greatest writer of all time? Think about that. So now we are here at the end of this episode. Thank you very much for watching the Rizal Lectures. This is Sir Jet saying see you around.